So at the May 1984 conference, the then president of the Federation of Labour, Jim Knox, told delegates that the union movement had tried and failed to oppose Muldoon's anti-union policies. And this was obviously the extension of the wage freeze and the abolition of compulsory unionism. This was a startling admission from someone who just in the years previous had called the Federation of Labour the real opposition to the Muldoon government, and who had advocated and had proven that industrial action was an effective tool in achieving political aims and in defeating a government. The FOL was, Knox said, now fighting for its survival, as was the union movement in general, and what was needed above all was a change of government. So what led to Knox's despondency by early 1984, and what did that mean for the remainder of the 1980s? And that's the question that I want to draw on, I want to address today, which is a broader story of the Federation of Labour's industrial and political strategy during the economic crisis of the era and the neoliberal response to that crisis after 1984. And what I want to do is give an overview of how the Federation of Labour responded to the challenges of the 1980s. So how to do that in 20 minutes. I want to focus on four moments in time, four Federation of Labour conferences, 1980, 81, 84 and 86, to provide a window or a snapshot into the fortunes of the FOL at different points in time. And what I want to try to do is understand the Federation of Labour's response as the events unfolded, rather than in the shadow of the CTU and the ECA, the Employment Contracts Act. So in the 1970s and 80s, the Federation of Labour was a powerful countervailing force in New Zealand's political and economic life. At its peak, it represented 48% of all wage earners, over 500,000 people organised into 250 affiliated unions. Its presidents, Skinner and Knox, during this period were household names and recognised spokespeople for the industrial movement, labour movement. They commanded the attention of prime ministers and regularly walked the halls of power. Into the 1980s, however, the Federation of Labour faced a number of challenges, and from Muldoonism to Rogernomics, this was a period of tectonic shifts in economic policy. This was also in the context, of course, of global restructuring of capital, which saw savage retrenchment and strike breaking across the world. So in this context, the Federation faced vexing questions about its own future, questions that were contested at every level, from the workplace to the major strikes of the era, and in my focus today, to the conference floor. Many of you will have attended Federation of Labour conferences in your time. You'll know they ran for 4 days. There was the presidential address, the annual report, which gave a rundown of the state of the movement. There were reports from the various Federation of Labour subcommittees, guest speakers from as far away as Chile and South Africa, and delegates debated remits brought forth by union delegates. The Labour leader always spoke, and the press covered these conferences in great detail. Those in power also kept close watch on the decisions made. And you only have to look at Muldoon's personal papers and archives to know that he kept a very keen interest in what was happening at the Federation of Labour conferences. So looking at the conference as a window into the fortunes and the strategies of the FOL, I think they come alive as places where opposing visions of the future of the union movement, of what a union movement should be, were debated and finally decided. And in the conferences we can see the precise moments at which the labour movement took certain paths and rejected others. Now, it's important to say as well that the Federation is much more than its leadership and its conference. Its activities were much wider than its industrial and political strategy, and I think Toby and Sibel's talk will give us a better sense of the kind of bottom-up organising of the trade union movement. So this is a limited and partial view of the Federation's activities. So we'll begin with 1980, and that's just after the Kinleith, the resolution of the Kinleith dispute. The Federation meets in a sense with a sense of victory and strength coming off the back of that dispute, as well as a new and more militant leadership with the election of Jim Knox and Ken Douglas the previous year. Looking back at the long view, Pat Walsh has claimed that 1979 leadership change marked the end of the ideologically conservative and strategically cautious Federation since 1937, in particular under its old leader, Tom Skinner. And in what was an implicit critique of the old Federation of Labour, Jim Knox said, "There will be no politicking, there will be no wheeling or dealing or anything else. I will not be going to the Parliament cap in hand, and it's high time that the Prime Minister realise this." Ken Douglas, the Secretary, said that the change at the top was in step and tune with the mood of the affiliated unions. And he said that the Federation of Labour was being returned to its affiliates. Kinleith became something of a symbol of the new leadership, as well as the new mood of the affiliates, and it appeared to vindicate the view of the new leadership that industrial action was an effective tool to achieve political aims, in that case the defeat of the Remuneration Act. In its conference paper, the Federation concluded that if the militant actions of workers are supported by the wider trade union movement and the community, then the forces of capital have an extremely difficult job on their hands of resisting the united pressure of the working class. And I think another sign of the change was Knox's claim that when he went into negotiations, he took the whole 38 delegates with him at Kinleith. The 1980 conference was also marked by the adoption of the Women's Working Charter, which Claire Louise talked about before, which was just one expression of a broader kind of challenge to the male bastion that was the Federation of Labour, the focus on the male breadwinner wage, and an attempt to widen union focus to questions of equal pay and equal opportunity and the fight against discrimination. So after 1980, in short, the Federation had a renewed sense of purpose and strength, and as Raymond Harbridge had it, it was ready to take on the challenges of the 1980s, or the problems of the 1980s. The mood of the 1981 conference stood in stark contrast. The year marked a turning point for the Federation of Labour. The government pursued a harder line as the economy deteriorated and unemployment increased. Then, in early 1981, an estimated 60,000 people marched down the streets of Auckland in what was then one of the largest rallies in the country's history, the anti-union Kiwi Care March led by Tanya Harris. It was just one expression of a growing conservatism and anti-unionism that viewed unions as self-interested and internally coercive institutions, organisations that contributed to the inflation that undermined living standards rather than being a defender of the wage earner. And the march chastened the Federation of Labour and emboldened the Muldoon government after 1981. As Knox told the 81 conference, this might mean that we need to rethink our strategy on industrial action. It may mean industrial action has to be scaled down to provide the opportunity for such work to be undertaken, these are Knox's words, because action undertaken without the full understanding and support of the members can only lead to defeat. Commentators again pointed out the change in attitude or the change of mood from 1980. Again, Raymond Harbridge said that the unity that had been expressed in the aftermath of Kinleith had been placed under considerable strain, and that union morale had taken a battering in the context of the Tanya Harris Kiwi Care March. The 1981 conference was also notable for another significant but perhaps more subtle development, and that was the adoption of the alternative economic strategy. This was the work of the economist Alf Kirk, and it was in part to dispel the view that the Federation was solely a reactive force that focused squarely on wages and conditions. As Kirk said, we need to have an alternative program for trade union workers in the context of a changing economy, to restructure the economy in the interests of the working class. Among those who advocated this alternative strategy was a new group of trade unionists who would go on to advocate what would become known as strategic unionism. And it was an agenda that was aimed to hold on to and reassert the gains of the post-war period, The language was of a kind of democratic socialism, but it was a corporatist approach, calling for a combination of union organisation with a relationship with the political wing, the Labour Party. And that brings us to 1984, where we started. So May 1984, the conference comes just months after Muldoon extends a wage freeze that's been in place since 1982, abolishes compulsory unionism, and this is coming just in the wake of the bombing of the Trades Hall, the grim conclusion to what trade unionists had called the hatred campaign, stirred up by Muldoon and the press. At the 1984 conference, Jim Knox outlined what was the strategy going forward, and that was, to elect a Labour government in that year's election, which was expected for November, the repeal of anti-union legislation, an alternative economic strategy, action on racism and sexism, the achievement of a minimum living wage, forging links with the unemployed. Yet it was clear that the real focus was on changing the government. As Knox said, it was in the government's capacity to, quote, change the rules that had revealed the weaknesses of the movement. And the president of the Labour Party then, Jim Anderton, explained that the trade union movement had its back against the wall, and they have turned to the Labour Party for a political solution. Another important development on the road to strategic unionism was the election of Rob Campbell on the Federation of Labour Executive. Campbell, like Kirk, advocated the alternative economic strategy and an attempt to kind of forge an Australian-style accord with the Labour Party. Kirk and Campbell had been the authors of After the Freeze, and they advocated this kind of approach. So Knox's admission of defeat, which I alluded to at the beginning of this talk, did not mean that Muldoon had triumphed, however. Rather, they had reached something of a stalemate or an impasse. And just a month after the conference, Muldoon called the snap election that would end his long term in office. And what broke the stalemate was not a new consensus, but rapid neoliberal market reforms. And that brings us to the final conference that I'm looking at, which is 1986. And the FOL meets for its 86th conference 2 years into the fourth Labour government. Since 1984, the changes have been monumental. Rogernomics and the new right are now part of the lexicon. And while the Labour government ended the wage freeze and restored compulsory unionism, it also pursued a rapid program of deregulation. The Federation of Labour attempted but failed to lobby for a change in direction, while workers took industrial action on a massive scale and made significant gains. It's important to note too that while the Federation of Labour spent a lot of its energies lobbying for change in economic policy, it saw industrial action as part of a challenge to Rogernomics. As Bill Anderson said, the key political point is not just the wage rise, but a fight against the whole economic policy imposed by Roger Douglas. Knox's advice to affiliates was also that, to accept a low-wage offer would be to underwrite an unacceptable economic policy. And the government itself kind of recognised this fact when Longy threatened wage controls in 1985 and said that the government is not going to allow its economic strategy to be destroyed, which was kind of a recognition of the fact that strike action could be a kind of spanner in the works of the reform agenda. So by the time the Federation of Labour met for its conference in May 1986, a change in policy direction was going nowhere, and Rogernomics went full steam ahead, as we know. And in perhaps Knox's most quoted words, he said, he excoriated the government and said, this mindless purism, this ideological straitjacket, this market madness is tearing our country apart. And so I say to you, the Labour government, give us an economic plan, give us planning based on social and economic consensus, and give us the economic policy in which you were elected. Yet Knox also warned against what he saw as the more pernicious policies of the National Party, which had taken up the mantle of labour market deregulation. And the conference voted to allow the Federation of Labour to attempt to reach an accord, a wage accord, with the Labour government for the 86 wage round. This was, in Bert Roth's assessment, an open admission that the trade union movement lacked the strength to change the government, its free market policies, and that it would have to find the best bargain possible to protect itself in a deregulated economy. The conference also debated and then voted on the creation of the Council of Trade Unions, which is connected to this story. And the debate of the creation of the CTU reflected long-standing debates about how to respond to the challenges of the 1980s. As the vote was decided, a number of unions walked out in protest. Rob Campbell, in favour of the CTU, for one, claimed that it would be a modern, industrially strong, central organisation for all workers to give the Round Table a run for its money, as well as the National Party, Treasury, Employers Federation, the alliance calling for labour market deregulation. Critics, such as Conor Leary of the railway workers, saw the Accord and the CTU as a two-headed wedge towards class collaboration. Critics suggested that the CTU would be replacing a democratic working class movement with what would be merely a lobby group. Another fear and a later criticism of the CTU was that it would serve as an instrument of discipline against an industrially militant union movement. And this was a view that reflected a broader critique of corporatist arrangements. So for some, this was a kind of betrayal of the idea of the Federation of Labour since 1980, a union movement that was being returned to the affiliates. For others, it was a way to avoid, in Campbell and other people's view, what was a self-destructive militancy that would only damage the prospects of the future union movement. So to conclude, the 80s marked the most turbulent years for the Federation of Labour, as well as its final years. And the Federation, as we know, is no short of critics. For those on the left, it was a organisation that by 1986 gave up the fight and accepted the logic of neoliberal reforms. For others, it was the failure to secure an Australian-style accord. While for the right, the Federation of Labour represented everything that was wrong with 1970s-style trade unionism. And I don't want to go into these critiques, but I do want to conclude on some broader thoughts, which is that what's striking about this period in the 80s, and perhaps it's true of most periods in retrospect, is that it was driven by both the seeming juggernaut of broader changes of greater forces, the global restructuring of capital, and also so often by the decisions, interactions, and the miscalculations sometimes of a small group of individuals. So it's a history that sits at the intersection of both a monotonous sense of inevitability and also a dizzying array of contingencies and possibilities. And I think that gets at the question we've posed for the symposium, which is, does history provide the answers for how to attempt to address the current crisis, or can it serve as a trap in our attempts to imagine new possibilities? That history provides lessons is probably, maybe too obvious to state. What those lessons are is another question altogether, but that it can serve as a trap is perhaps less frequently understood or discussed. And where I think it can serve as a trap is when we get sucked into debating the same questions of a past era. Debating what could have been can be a kind of trap of history, but so can treating the past changes as unstoppable and inevitable. And as the Australian historian Frank Bongiorno writes, the task of the labour movement today is surely to expand the possibilities of politics rather than to accept the limits on our political and industrial imaginations that the 1980s imposed. Yet I think, given the significant imprint of those transformations in the present, the question of what could have been remains an important one. In the end, the roads not taken had serious implications, and we live with them today, even if the debates, the politics, and much of the language of the era seem foreign to us now. Finally, I think the questions that the Federation of Labour faced remain relevant today. What is the role of industrial action? How does the labour movement convey its message to the public? How does it connect with the community and the public in a way that it cannot possibly be accused of being apart from the public, as it was, during the Kiwi Care rally. What is its alternative economic strategy, should it have one? What is its response to or relationship with political power and party politics? And how, during a period of economic downturn or crisis of capital, should the union movement respond? And I think these are all questions that remain on the agenda, even if they demand a new set of answers. And I look forward to the final session to discuss the contemporary implications of the 1980s today. Thank you.